because we're in a building that was finished in 1819. The architect was David Hoadley, and as I said, finished in 1819. It's been a thriving faith family ever since the doors were opened. It was a place then, as it is now, to thank God for the thanksgivings of our lives, and a place to be a community of support when the vicissitudes of life mount, which they sometimes do. But for context, in a Connecticut history sense, I'll just say that Congregationalism, which is what this still is, but part of the United Church of Christ, but it remained the established state religion until 1818, so the year before this church was finished, when Connecticut passed a new state constitution replacing the old laws of colonial charter obtained first in 1662. Before then, non-Christians even could be taxed in order to support the established church. So these were new times for this new community building this church. There was the beginnings of the separation of church and state. But what of our two heroes that we'll meet tonight? Where were they in 1819 when this very room that you inhabit was first built? As you look around and soak in the history, all those hand-carved little details of beautiful architecture. Well, Abraham Lincoln, Mother Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died of milk sickness in 1819 in Spencer County, Indiana. This is all according to Library of Congress, so I defer to the Library of Congress as far as the accuracy of this data. Thomas Lincoln, his dad, Abraham Lincoln's dad, subsequently left Abraham Lincoln and the elder sister Sarah alone in Indiana when he traveled to Kentucky to remarry. And in 1819, he married, I think that she died in 1818. He married in 1819 Sarah Bush Johnston in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And then eventually, she had 3 children of her own, and she did eventually develop a close bond with Abraham Lincoln. So that's good. Imagine he had a terrible stepmother. You know, history could be very different today. But what about Frederick Douglass, the great American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman? What was this man doing in 1819? Well, he was barely a year old. So he was doing what all babies doing. He was doing it, what he does in his little nappies, and he was looking for mom or dad and however he can get some help. But this is the reality about this guy. Born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, a slave in Tuckahoe, Talbot County, Maryland. His mother was a slave, Harriet Bailey. His father, according to the Library of Congress, rumored to be their very master, Aaron Anthony, a white man. In 1819, the year that this was built, he was raised by grandmother Betsy Bailey at the Home Hill Farm where he was born, and he saw his mother only a few times. How was his life affected? So that's a little bit about where you're sitting, the context of being in this wonderful place of history. And now I'm going to introduce Terry Wilson, who is the president of the Historical Society, to give you some further information before we bring out our great men.
Thank you. So who's the better president of the Historical Society? I mean, really, that was terrific. I didn't expect all that. Thank you, Pastor Chris, for the introduction. As he said, it's fitting that we're sitting in this sanctuary because when it was built in 1819 as a meeting house, which is what they were called, it was the meeting place for the citizens of the area to worship, to hear speeches, watch dramatic events unfold, and hold town meetings. All meeting houses were the foundation of the democracy of our country. It was the biggest building in town where everybody could get together. For example, church historian Nora Howard informs us that in February of 1839, 9 male members of this church signed with 1,700 others in Connecticut to form the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society. Therefore, we know that race in America was a topic preached in this sanctuary for the last 200 years. While the church, the library, and the Historical Society have separate missions, we share fully in one, to provide humanities-based discussions that are meaningful for our respective audiences. And so, to reach a wider audience, I need to let you know that this event is being live streamed on the Avon Congregational Church Facebook page and will be posted on the church's and the Society's websites within a few days. Tonight's event is sponsored by an anonymous donor who felt that this topic and format is very important for understanding the historic context of race in America. A small additional amount of funding comes from a Connecticut Humanities Summer at the Museum grant awarded to the Historical Society. And I thank you all for your patience in this. I know we started this a year ago. Then we were going to have it on Zoom in February, and then things went south after that. And for a lot of reasons, it's great that we're here tonight, so thank you very much for sticking with us through it all. A reception, as Pastor Chris said, will be held immediately after in the Fellowship Hall. Now I'm pleased to present our moderator for tonight, Matthew Warschauer, Professor of History at Central Connecticut State University, who many of you may recall was the co-chair of the statewide sesquicentennial commemoration of the Civil War from 2011 to 2015. He will bring us back in time in history that bears repeating. Matt, would you please come out?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I want to make clear as we begin, I am not one of the great men. As Terry said, this was a long time in the making, right? We were supposed to be here a year ago, and then as she noted, we were going to do it online, and things didn't work out. And in a way, I'm sort of glad the online didn't work out. It would have been nice, but it's not the same as being in this historic place. And I remember the first time that I saw Frederick Douglass here many, many years ago, and it was literally stepping through a window in time to see him talk about his life and this troubling time in our nation's history. So what I would like to do right now is tell you a little bit about our format. As you probably know, if you are Lincoln fans or Douglass fans, you know that they only met a couple of times. So this is not a direct dialogue, or most of the program tonight is not a direct dialogue between them. What we thought we would do is try to give you as comprehensive an overview of what these men experienced preceding the war, through the war, and in its immediate aftermath. So that becomes a little bit tricky, all right? So we've broken this up into very distinct segments, and my job is to sort of usher you into a particular period of time, and then President Lincoln will present to you, and then Mr. Douglass will present to you, and then we'll go back into a different period of time where I will transition you in. And I think it's sort of a unique approach to the program. We hope that it keeps it a little bit lively, and then when we finish up the last section, we're going to go into contemporary America and some of the issues that continue to plague our nation long in the aftermath of the American Civil War. And at that point, President Lincoln and Mr. Douglass will actually, for a few moments, come out of character and be happy to answer your questions and engage with you in a discussion of these issues that we've gone over, or anything that you feel is really important as it relates to these issues. So we want this to be a really fascinating introduction and overview of these two important American figures, but we also want it to be provocative, and we want it to be an opportunity for you to ask questions and share your thoughts, because this place is, of course, about community. Okay? Fair enough? You ready? We're going to go, just so you know, I want to mention we're going to go a bit over an hour, so I just want you to know. Okay? You guys all set? President Lincoln, sir. Mr. Douglass. The problem of slavery and the enslaved African race and African American race is baked into the very heart of the United States. From early on in our nation, when the first African Americans were brought to this country in 1619 to Virginia, some were enslaved, some were indentured servants and worked their way out of bond. And it has been a great focus of study and debate among historians ever since as to whether or not slavery was in fact, one could argue, the original sin of America, and how it has impacted us. Whether it was slated by some of the founders who believed that perhaps one day it would simply die out of its own accord, or if it would expand and extend across the nation. It was written into the very code of our society within the United States Constitution. Though slavery was not mentioned by name, there were 3 specific clauses in the United States Constitution that supported the institution. The Declaration of Independence, of course, discussed that all men are created equal. The single largest section of the Declaration of Independence that was removed by the Congress was a fairly significant paragraph by Thomas Jefferson blaming the King of England for the existence of slavery in these colonies and in this new nation. And as I said, many hoped that slavery would ultimately die out, but we have to remember that every single one of the 13 original states were slaveholding. Connecticut itself only began the process of gradual emancipation in 1784. And gradual emancipation meant that slavery would be gotten rid of over a long period of time. Slavery isn't fully gotten rid of in the state of Connecticut until 1848, if you can believe that. Connecticut has its own troubled past with the history of slavery that a lot of people don't understand. Terry mentioned that an abolition society was created through this community and with this church, but there are many pastors throughout Connecticut, and I have a grad student who's working on this project right now. Many churches removed their pastors and ministers for advocating abolition. So Connecticut, like the rest of the United States, was extremely divided over the institution of slavery and very much over the issue of race. Even those African Americans who gained their freedom or were born into freedom, both within Connecticut and in other parts of the country, whether it be north or south, were viewed as lesser, as unequal to those whites who controlled American society. And of course, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass grew up in this nation and seeing these things and confronting and dealing with the issue of slavery. And both of their views on this issue evolved over time. And so what we are going to begin with this evening with President Lincoln and Mr. Douglass are the pre-war years, primarily the 1830s through up into the 1860s. And it's the 1830s. Why are the 1830s so important? Because that's when the abolition movement in the United States really begins to take off by using modern technology of the time, the steam-powered printing press, and all kinds of marketing devices that we would recognize today, not Twitter, right? But for advocating on behalf of the freedom of the enslaved. But let's also be clear, just like Connecticut was divided, I said the nation was divided. At most in the 1830s and 1840s, perhaps all the way into the 1850s, at most 10% of those in the North are active abolitionists. We often forget this and we think that the Civil War is as simple as believing the moral North was opposed to the immoral South. It's never that simple. It's always far, far more complex. And one of the reasons that for the last 150 to 160 years, historians have been debating and arguing over the meaning of the Civil War, the meaning of slavery, over Abraham Lincoln's legacy. Right? All of these things are intermixed into this 1830s through 1850s and 1860s period. So, with that, President Lincoln.
I was 29 when I made a speech to the Young Men's Lyceum in Illinois. It was 1838, just over 60 years since the Declaration of Independence had been signed. I explored my concerns that there was an underlying fundamental threat to our founding fathers' work. I explored the fact that there was just then passions arising that could lead to mob rule, and already instances of the mob had occurred, as I said, down among the pleasure-hunting owners of slaves in Louisiana, up to the order-loving citizens in the land of steady habits. The common citizen may despair at the loss of the rule of law and of free government. An extraordinary man of tyrannical ambitions could use that despair and destroy the institutions and the practice of self-government. The threat, I said, comes from within this country, or, as I said, at what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Passions for and against the institution of slavery were divided in this country. As sectional differences between these parts increased over slavery, I had a correspondence with a friend of mine, Joshua Speed, about my view of slavery. You know I dislike slavery, and you fully admit the abstract wrong of it. I acknowledge your rights and my obligations under the Constitution in regard to your slaves. I confess I hate to see the poor creatures hunted down and caught and carried back to their strats and unrewarded toils, but I bite my lip and keep quiet. In 1841, you and I had together a tedious low-water trip on a steamboat from Louisville to St. Louis. You may remember, as I well do, that from Louisville to the mouth of the Ohio, there were on board 10 or a dozen slaves, shackled together with irons. That sight was a continued torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio or any other slave border. It is hardly fair for you to assume that I have no interest in a thing which has and continuously exercises the power of making me miserable. Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal, except Negroes. I have always hated slavery. I cannot remember a time when I did not so think and feel. Growing up, my family attended anti-slavery churches. I lived on a farm, and although my father taught me how to work hard, he did not teach me how to love farming. And I thought it was an injustice that he would rent me out to a neighboring farmer where I would do the work and he would pocket the payment. When I made speeches about slavery, I often said that any man who did a day's worth of work should himself be paid for that labor. In 1858, in my acceptance speech to run as a Republican for the senator from Illinois, I quoted the Bible and talked about how I felt was the future of slavery. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. While I was not elected senator, I did write how I felt eventually slavery would end up. I cannot but regard it as possible that the higher object of this contest may not be completely contained within the term of my natural life, but I cannot doubt either that it will come in due time. In 1860, I ran as a Republican to become the United States president. I took the conservative view ever since George Washington and all the presidents after, that we would leave slavery alone where it already existed in the states, but we would not let it extend into the national territories. And even though my name was not on any of the Southern ballots, I was elected the 16th president. Shortly after I was elected, I received a letter from a friend who was also a Georgia congressman. He wanted to know what I now intended to do with slavery, and parts of my reply are as follows. To Alexander H. Stevens, for your eye only. Do the people of the South really entertain fears that a Republican administration would, directly or indirectly, interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves? The South would be in no more danger in this respect than it was in the days of Washington. I suppose, however, this does not meet the case. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think slavery is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub. It certainly is the only substantial difference between us. Yours, very truly, A. Lincoln.
I was born a slave. A person supposedly owned by another man. A person who could own nothing. A person who was worked without pay or compensation. I'm often asked, Mr. Douglas, you were a slave. What was the worst thing that you remember that ever happened to you as a slave? And I always tell them the same answer. When I was a baby, a tiny infant, I was taken out of the arms of my mother, and she was sold. I lived with her mother, grandmother Betsy. And I recall seeing my mother only a few times in my life. Living with grandmother Betsy, I did what most children do. I played. I threw sticks and stones and chased little animals along the fence row. You see, as a child, I didn't know I was a slave. As I grew older, my grandmother came to me and said, "We're going on a long journey tomorrow. I want you to gather up your things, go to bed early. The next morning we set out before daylight, and we walked and walked and walked. Soon we came upon another cabin. It was bigger than our cabin. It had little boys and girls of all colors and all sizes and all shapes. Grandmother Betsy said, "Look, boy, those are your kinfolk. Go play with them." I didn't know who they were, so I saw a big shade tree, and I sit down and fell asleep. And soon a little boy came over to me. I believe it was my brother Perry. And he shook me awake. He said, boy, Grandmammy gone." And I jumped up and I looked this way and I looked that way. And I began to call her name louder and louder. She didn't answer. Soon I realized Grandmother Betsy was gone. And I began to cry and cry.